My task today is to talk to you about the Cultural Revolution, a subject which is rarely mentioned in China. What was the Cultural Revolution? It was a period of killing and chaos, political struggle, and almost civil war in many cases throughout the country. And it lasted from the middle of the 60s till the middle of the 1970s. And here's what the survivors, the leading survivors of the Cultural Revolution, how they described it. The Cultural Revolution, which lasted from May 1966 to October 1976, was responsible for the most severe setback and the heaviest losses suffered by the party, the state, and the people since the founding of the People's Republic. It was initiated and led by Comrade Mao Zedong. Now, before I come to the role of Mao Zedong, I just want to make one small comment on that analysis. And that is that, yes, the Cultural Revolution was responsible for terrible losses to the party and state. The basic institutions of the party and the government were shredded and didn't function properly for many years. But the greatest losses for the people of China were not during the Cultural Revolution, despite the killing, the violence, and the volatility of the mobs that the Cultural Revolution witnessed. The greatest tragedy for the people of China was, of course, the Great Famine, caused by the economic policies that Mao Zedong also initiated and led from 1959 to 1962. Maybe 30, 40 million people, no one knows, died at that time. During the Cultural Revolution, the casualties were large, but not anywhere near that number. We don't know and probably never will know how many people perished. Why did Mao Zedong do this? What was it all about? Mao Zedong, of course, was the leader of China. He had led the army and the party to take over in China in 1949, and suddenly in 1966, he initiated a movement, a mass mobilization of the citizens of China, particularly the students of high schools and universities, to tear all that apart. Why would the founder of what was arguably the most disciplined and best organized state in the communist world, why would the founder want to tear it all down? Well, it starts a little earlier, just after the famine, when Mao's colleagues wanted to adjust the collectivist policies of the chairman in the countryside particularly, but also in the cities, in order to give incentives for the country to recover from the Great Famine. And Mao Zedong thought that they were beginning to lose their enthusiasm for the goals which he and they had shared when they first came to power in 1949. He began to suspect that they were what he would later call revisionists, that they would revise the holy doctrine of Lenin and Stalin. And he was encouraged to think this because of what he thought he saw happening in the Soviet Union. China and Russia, of course, had started off as great friends when the communists came to power in the late 40s, early 50s. Russia had been the model. And then Mao went sour on the Soviet Union. And he began to think that the Soviet leaders, the leaders of the homeland, the motherland of the original revolution, were betraying the theories of Lenin. They were revisionists. How were they revisionists? Because they were appeasing the United States of America. They were trying to ensure that there would be no world war between the Soviet Union and the United States. The Russians, who had suffered desperately during World War II, lost millions of lives, much of the economy destroyed, had no wish to see it all redone again in another world war. And so there was talk of peaceful coexistence between Moscow and Washington. And Mao felt squeezed out by this. He felt that the Russians were deserting their allies, the Chinese, who weren't allowed into the United Nations by the Americans and their allies. And he increasingly got angry with the Soviet Union, and he began to accuse them of revising Leninist doctrine, which said there will inevitably be war between capitalism and socialism. And what the Russians were doing was to try to ensure there never would be war between socialism and capitalism. Mao had once remarked at a great meeting in Moscow that, oh, if there were an atomic war, maybe half the world's population would die, but on the ruins of a dead imperialism, we would build a new and beautiful socialist society. And that, of course, sent a shiver down the spines of the Russians and their East European allies when they heard it. They regarded him as a warmonger. So gradually, in the late 50s and early 60s, the Russians and the Chinese were growing apart. And what Mao thought was happening in the Soviet Union was that the desertion of the principles of Leninism was so serious that he, Mao, had to ensure that if Moscow was no longer the center of world communism, that Beijing would take its place, and he, Mao, would be the theoretician who would explain why and how the revolution should go forward. And in the mid-60s, he became obsessed with the idea that the future of the revolution depended on revolutionary successors, that you had to have the right people to take over. The people who had taken over from Stalin and the Soviet Union had proved not to be up to the job of maintaining the revolution. And he, Mao, was going to ensure that the people who succeeded him would be up to maintaining the revolution in China. And because of the moderate policies which his colleagues, his senior colleagues, Liu Shaoqi, head of state, and others had embraced in the aftermath of the famine, he began to suspect them equally of being no longer up to the job of leading a communist state if he weren't there, that they too would be revisionists. And so he began to think about rearing a new generation of revolutionary successors. But how to do it? There was no revolution. How do you train people? Mao and his colleagues had fought for decades in order to come to power. They knew what revolution was. But the young people of China, the notional successors, they didn't know anything about revolution. So what Mao decided to do was to unleash them, to make an artificial revolution domestically in which they would learn what a revolution was all about. Now, he couldn't do this immediately, because if he'd gone to his colleagues in the Politburo and said, you know, you guys are no longer up to scratch on revolution. I'm going to have to get rid of you and have to bring up a new generation. Then at last, perhaps, his colleagues would do something that they'd never done before. They would stand together united and say, no, you're not going to do this, you better retire. But they didn't. They hadn't, and they didn't. And so what Mao decided to do, a guerrilla fighter that he had been all his life, was to employ guerrilla tactics in politics. And the first thing he did was to, before he launched the revolution, was to eliminate some of the people whom he thought would try to stop him. The first victims in May '66 were the boss of Beijing, the man who could perhaps have controlled the capital against Mao. The boss of propaganda, who might have adulterated Mao's message. The chief of staff of the army, who might not have backed a military approval of Mao's revolution. And the head of the general office of the party's central committee. Sounds very innocuous, but this was a man who controlled the paper flow, and therefore the information that went to all the leaders of China. Those were got rid of in a campaign that lasted from late '65 to May '66. And then he moved on to his next targets, who were to be Liu Shaoqi, his number two, who'd been the number two in China since 1945, 21 years, and Deng Xiaoping, long a favorite of Mao's, but someone he felt was betraying him. But before he went to that, he decided to give them enough rope to hang themselves, so he had a justification for getting rid of them. What he did was he got some of his colleagues, now formed into what was called a Cultural Revolution group. They included his wife, who had hitherto not played any political role. And Madame Mao and her colleagues stirred up the students in the university with the idea that Mao's thought, Mao's leadership was under threat, and that they had to do something about it. And what they did was to start a revolution on campuses. And soon the campuses of the capital were in chaos, as teachers were beaten up, administrators were holed up in their offices and besieged. And Liu Shaoqi and his colleagues flew down to central China where Mao was resting and said, "Come back to the capital. We don't understand what this Cultural Revolution is all about. Please come back and lead it." And he said, as he often did when he was planning something, he shrugged them off, said, "No, no, no, you can do it. I trust you. Go back." So they went back to the capital and they did what was standard operating procedure for a Communist Party. They sent into the campuses what were called work teams, groups of civil servants, workers and others of mature age, to sort out what was happening on campus and to bring calm to the campuses. Well, that happened for about a month or so. Then Mao came back from the south and attacked Liu Shaoqi and Deng Xiaoping and others for suppressing the students. "Why are you suppressing their revolutionary urges?" he said. And that was the grounds for their being dismissed at a party meeting which he summoned that summer.